Thanks for coming out on this very rainy Thursday to the CHEP seminar. We have Seth Gershenson here to join us this week from American University, where he's an associate professor of public affairs and is also a research fellow at the Institute for Labor Economics. Seth does work on the economics of education, is published in the top policy journals in his field, Education, Finance and Policy, Policy Analysis and Management, Economics of Education Review, and we're very fortunate to have him here this week to talk about this topic on the long-run impacts of same-race teachers. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the meetings today. It's been a busy day of stimulating discussions, and I hope to get more stimulating feedback about this paper, so please feel free to interrupt and ask questions and give me ideas about how to make it better. Like Joe said, I'm looking at the long-run impacts of same-race teachers. This is joint work with a whole cast of characters, including one Californian, Cassie Hart, Josh Hyman at UConn, really helped us with the long-run STAR data. Constance Lindsay is in DC with me at the Urban Institute, and Nick Papageorge is at Johns Hopkins. And so to motivate the paper sort of very broadly, I guess there's two key points. The first key point is that there's increasing calls all over the place for diversifying the teacher labor force. Some of this is coming from policy advocates and foundations. Some of this is coming from schools and districts and administrators and policymakers themselves. And these calls are centered on two facts. The first fact is that over the past 30 or 40 years, the student body in the US has gotten much less white, whereas the teaching force has stayed evenly about 80% white. So the student body's diversifying, the teacher force is not, and it's sort of out of whack, and we want it to get back in whack. I don't think that's a thing. You know, get back in line. The other reason that this might matter is that Tom D. And others have documented pretty strong, robust, contemporaneous effects of having a same-race teacher on test scores. But test scores are not what we care about in the long run. We care about test scores to the extent that they're a proxy for the long run outcomes we really care about. And we don't know, prior to our paper here, whether these effects carry over to the long run effects that we do care about, like earnings, college going, etc. The second motivation for this paper is that Chetty, Friedman, and Rockoff document long-run effects of teachers in a value-added sense. They find that some teachers are better at increasing students' lifetime earnings and other long-run outcomes than other teachers, but they don't know why, right? They're not able to articulate or identify the mechanisms through which an elementary school teacher would increase your earnings or increase the likelihood you go to college, etc. And so we can speak a little bit to that and suggest some possible mechanisms about why teachers early in elementary school would matter for long-run outcomes. Specifically, the fact that we do find long-run race match effects suggests that there's some possible things happening in terms of role models and biased expectations. And we're going to try to sort out some of those mechanisms too.
Good question.
Yeah.
Historically, I mean, obviously the movement to desegregate schools in the American South were driven by big resource differences sort of across students, but were people worried then about potentially one of the unintended consequences of desegregation being to sort of pull some African American students away from African American teachers, which could have unintended consequences?
So I don't know that people were worried about that at the time. I think, I was talking with someone today about the Revisionist History podcast, which is a good title for what we're talking about, who talks about this idea, and basically the desegregation movement after Brown versus Board, it didn't just cause less race matches to happen, it literally pulled black women out of the teaching force, period. And I think the ramifications of that are still being felt in many states in the South. But I don't know. I don't know if that was a an intention or not, or something even that people thought about at the time. Yeah.
The desegregation movement caused black women to lose their jobs as teachers?
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
Because it effectively closed black schools. It closed black-owned schools. And yeah.
Makes sense.
Okay. So the questions we're going to ask are two, one of which we can answer pretty convincingly, I hope. You can tell me how successful we are at that. And that is very simply, do same-race teachers affect long-run outcomes? And we're going to use different data sets, different strategies to hopefully convince you that yes, they do. The second question, which is just as interesting and important, but is going to lead to a more speculative answer, is why? So we're going to propose a theory that's consistent with our results and think about which of these theories are happening. And just to set up a frame of reference, there's three reasons that these effects might be there. The first is that black teachers are simply better teachers in the schools that black teachers attend. And you might think that that's true because there's a long literature on teacher sorting that shows that when white teachers gain experience, they tend to move away from schools with more minority students, and they move to the richer suburbs that are also whiter. So if that sort of sorting is happening, it might be that the schools that have black students have rookie, novice white teachers who aren't as good as the more experienced black teachers, say. So this would be one story. A second story, consistent with the long literature in education and sociology, is that black teachers are better at teaching black students. They have specific skills that make them more effective with black students. Some people in the education literature call that teaching a hidden curriculum. They teach life skills and sort of life navigation skills. And also, there's a term called culturally relevant pedagogy, where teachers are essentially better communicators with same-race students. So this is another story distinct from story one. And then a third story distinct from both is that there's a more passive effect of having a black teacher. And we'll call that a true role model effect. And what we mean by a true role model effect is that the teacher's not doing anything differently, but rather their mere presence changes how black students engage with school. And to be clear, all three of these things could be happening together, right? None of them are mutually exclusive. And we're going to try to see what we can rule out and what we can't rule out, and see if there's evidence for the presence of these different stories. Okay. So to summarize our results, this is, I think, the first paper that can ever be summarized via a cartoon. This was a nationally syndicated cartoon by Keith Knight about a very early draft of our paper where he summarizes the result, which is that just having one black teacher can change students' expectations about college. Just one. And that's something to keep in mind, because we'll test for dosage effects later and use that dosage test to try to sort out the theories and mechanisms. He then goes on to explain that he only had one black teacher in his whole schooling career, and that black teacher was a substitute teacher who covered study hall and doodled during study hall. And then the young Keith Knight saw the substitute teacher cartooning and talked to him about it. And the substitute teacher asked him to come up and doodle with him. And so this story is entirely consistent with what we'll call role model effects. The point here is that this is not, this wasn't a subject class, right? This was a study hall substitute teacher. And this sort of summarizes what we're going to find. We're going to find evidence for role model effects as well as some of the other mechanisms. Okay, so we're going to use two different data sets, two different identification strategies. They each have their pros and cons. The first analysis, and the main analysis I'll talk about today, is going to leverage the Tennessee Star class size experiment. This is a famous field experiment in education that randomly assigned kids in schools in Tennessee in the mid-'80s to large and small classes. This class size experiment has been studied and restudied and reanalyzed dozens of times because this was a very big debate about whether class size matters. The Tennessee legislature poured tens of millions of dollars into running the experiment. But an unintended consequence of this was that when they randomly assigned kids and teachers to classrooms, other things got randomized besides class size. So there's papers about peer effects that use this random variation, as well as Tom Dee's 2004 paper using this random assignment to study the effect of same-race teachers on test scores. So we're essentially going to build on Tom Dee's paper to look at the race match effects on long-run outcomes. Okay. This is also what Chetty uses, if you've seen the NPR story about the $1 million kindergarten teacher. Chetty's QJE paper is using the STAR data linked to IRS earnings data, and he shows that being in a good kindergarten classroom increases lifetime earnings by $250,000 or something. So other people have used the STAR data to look at long-run outcomes and race match, and we're bringing this together to look at long-run effects of race match.
Has anything from the military academies looked at matching race among cadets?
So Mike Kofod, who I think was here not too long ago, has stuff about the race of your platoon leader or barracks leader, I think. Scott Carroll has papers about the Air Force Academy, but I think they're looking more at sex than race. But to be clear, in STAR, these are grades K to 3. So we're looking at very early elementary school. Okay, now, for a lot of reasons, you might be nervous about pinning all of this on STAR because this is a pretty unique set of disadvantaged schools in Tennessee in the 80s. So we're going to self-replicate our results using administrative data on the population of public school students in North Carolina, different state, much more recent cohorts. The only problem here is that there's no random assignment. So we're going to address this possibly non-random assignment by exploiting within-school variation in the racial composition of teachers over time.
And also, because it's more recent data, you can't get as many outcomes, long-run outcomes.
That's right. So, and that's why we stop in 2010, because we want to, we're going to look at what they were doing when they were a senior in high school. That's right. So there's a couple sort of nitty-gritty reasons why more recent North Carolina data is even better, because they have better linkages of students and teachers, but the kids aren't old enough to see what we want to see. So that said, we still have 5 cohorts of 3rd graders who are young, who were young enough then to see their long-run outcomes. We have about 100,000 of them. This is really good because now we have power to do some more careful testing and so on. And then we're going to deal with selection by following Bettinger and Long and essentially looking at within-school variation in the composition of the teaching force. And the argument there is going to be that in any given year, conditional on being in a school, whether there's 5 black teachers or 4 black teachers is conditionally random, and it's driven by things like sabbatical leaves and retirements and new hires. So conditional and school fixed effects, we're going to hope that there's a little random variation in the share of black teachers, and that could be an instrument for whether you do have a black teacher, or it could just be the reduced form effect of the presence of black teachers in your grade. I'll come back to whether we believe the instrument when we get to that. But the short answer is yes, we totally replicate the STAR results with the North Carolina data, suggesting this is a more prevalent phenomenon of race match effects mattering for long-run outcomes. Okay. In STAR, we're going to be able to link the STAR data to National Student Clearinghouse data on actual college enrollments, which is really fantastic, and entirely thanks to Sue Donarski and Diane Schossenbach for generously sharing their data that they painstakingly matched to the STAR data. In North Carolina, we were not able to link it to NSC data. So instead we have students self-reported college plans, as well as their high school graduation outcome. Okay, so I'm going to talk mostly about STAR, and then I'll talk a little bit about our mechanisms and testing, and then I'll talk about the North Carolina results, and then I'll wrap up. So that's the plan. So I'll say a little bit about STAR, since this is a more not entirely education audience. I'll give you a little background about STAR and the data. The identification is very simple because it's an experiment, and then I'll show you our results. Okay, so the first thing to know is that schools were invited to participate in the STAR experiment, but it was up to the school to opt in. They were free to opt in or opt out. So the state invited schools that were either serving low-income populations or schools that were low-performing. Urban, rural, statewide. And then schools were free to say yes or no. That's the first thing. About 80 schools opted in. This means that students who were in kindergarten in 1985-86 in a school who opted in became part of the experiment whether they wanted to or not. Okay? So the random assignment happens entirely within schools. Yeah? So everything we do is going to be conditional on school fixed effects, right? Because we want to compare kids who are in the same school who are assigned to a smaller regular class. Okay. The second thing to note is that the goal of this was to study class size. So there were 3 types of classes, and you were assigned to one of these 3 treatment arms. However, like I said, other things got randomized too. So we can do balance tests and everything looks good. And we'll control for what kind of class you were in, and we can test for heterogeneity and the match effect by class size and all that stuff. But this was the main goal of the experiment. Okay. And then lastly, a lot of the critiques of the STAR experiment have to do with attrition and non-compliance, the kind of things you'd worry about in any experiment. So STAR was supposed to last for 4 years, meaning that this is only for the kindergarten cohort, and if you're assigned to a small class in kindergarten, you are supposed to have a small class in 1st grade, 2nd grade, and 3rd grade. So it's supposed to be a sticky treatment that lasted 4 years. Kruger reviewed handwritten notes in the schools to verify that randomness happened in year 1. And there was no non-compliance in year 1 because no one knew about it to not comply yet. So in year 1, which was kindergarten of 1985-86, there's essentially perfect compliance. There is serious non-compliance in later years. So in 1st grade and 2nd grade, parents might have found out about the experiment and complained and gotten moved. Principals might have moved troublemakers to small classes or things like that. So there's non-compliance in later years. So we could deal with that by instrumenting for what they were supposed to have, or we could just focus on the 1st year assignment, which is what we'll mostly do. And then the other big complaint about STAR is attrition. Because if you left your STAR school, you are A, no longer part of the experiment, and B, we might not even know your outcomes. And remember, these are disadvantaged schools in the mid-'80s in Tennessee. This is a very mobile population. There's a lot of moving and changing schools and disappearing and so on. Okay, but that won't be a problem either, because again, we're going to focus on your 1st year in STAR and what happened to you. Now, for the data, as I was talking with some of you this morning, the STAR data is entirely public. Everything except for the NSC data you could download right now if you just Google STAR data. The STAR data that's public has basic student and teacher X's, like race. For the teachers, about their educational attainment, years of experience, stuff like that. For the kids, free lunch status. Their test scores. There's a middle school survey that has real attrition problems. And then it has SAT scores and whether you took the SAT, which is a good proxy for college intent. And then, of course, your class size and class size assignment. So, again, attrition is a real problem if you're trying to study test scores. Because if you change schools or you leave the state, you don't have any record. However, for the outcomes that we focus on, attrition is not a problem. And the reason is that we can look at things like SAT, ACT test taking, or college enrollment. Those things are coming not from the state of Tennessee, but from the College Board, or from the National Student Clearinghouse. And if you were part of the experiment in kindergarten, we know your name, and not we, including me, but someone could link that name to the College Board records. And if you ever took the SAT, they're going to find out whether you moved out of Tennessee or whatever. Okay. Same for the National Student Clearinghouse. If you went to a college that reported, you're going to be in the data whether you attrited or not. Okay. So there's some well-known papers about how attrition messes up the star analysis. That's true, but only if you're looking at test scores. When you're looking at these college outcomes, we're okay. So the summary stats, we have about 4,000 black students altogether. And you can see that when we split it out by cohort of entry, most people entered in kindergarten. However, cohort 2 entered in first grade, cohort 3 entered in second grade, cohort 4 entered in third grade. What I mean by that is, if you entered a star school for the first time in third grade, you still got randomly assigned to a small or large class in that fourth grade cohort. Yeah? So there's only one cohort in STAR. The kindergartners in 1985-86. Then there's 1, 2, 3, 4 years of those guys. Okay, so why do we need to worry about what cohort you entered? Well, at this time, kindergarten was optional. So that's a little weird, and you might worry that the people that are entering in kindergarten are different from the people who are entering in first grade. Another thing is just that if you're entering in cohort 3 or 4, that means that by definition you changed elementary schools early in life. And that mobility can be disruptive and problematic also. So we're going to deal with this by not just controlling on school fixed effects, but school by cohort fixed effects. So we're always going to be comparing kids who entered the same school at the same time. Okay, and you can see that the later cohorts are a little bit poorer, right? Cohort 1 is 74% ever poor versus in the 80s for later cohorts. 40% of the kids had a black teacher in their first year, and that's going to be our key independent variable. Did you have a black teacher in your first year of STAR? And that's fairly constant across the cohorts. Goes up a little bit. What else? Okay, and then here's our outcomes. High school graduation, which is missing a lot, and I'll come back to that. Did you take the SAT? Do you enroll in college?
Is that?
Yeah.
So for those of us who don't do, I wonder if you could kind of place some of these averages in terms of how they look relative to kind of a nationally representative grouping. Is for example about 27% taking the SAT pretty low? Is that relatively what we see across the country?
Well, it's certainly lower than what you see across the country because this is a sample of mostly poor black students.
Right.
So all of their educational numbers are lower than what you see. Now, I think the other question is like what? It's not obvious that you want to compare them to a national sample. Mm-hmm. The numbers don't look that different from a sample of low-income black students in North Carolina, say.
Okay.
Yeah. And another point, I guess, which is related is sort of this whole exercise. This whole exercise is really unique to black students' experiences. And in the way we're coding it, as you'll see later, white kids always have a white teacher at some point. Black kids don't always have a black teacher at some point.
Speaking of that, what does the exposure to black teachers look like across Tennessee, not necessarily within this program?
I don't know for this cohort. I would assume it would be less, because we know that black teachers are sorting into schools with more black students. I know there's a more recent paper about Tennessee, which I don't know the numbers off the top of my head.
So do you know the mechanism, like how they assign the classroom teachers based on this experiment? Is it after they know who are in which classroom and they assign a teacher, or they assign a teacher first before they actually assign the students? Because Yeah,
no, so I think it's supposed to be sort of simultaneously random assignments.
Okay.
How true that is, I guess we'll sort of never know, I guess.
But you do observe, like in your data, there is no correlation between the race of the teacher and the race.
Yeah. So we can show you the balance test, and this is essentially the same balance test in Tom B's paper. The balance test is limited by a few things, namely that since we're looking at kindergarten, there's no pretest to do balance on. So we only know a handful of things about the kids, but what do we know? What would be interesting to look at? Well, the only student things we have are sex and free lunch status, a measure of income. And then we know, did you get a small class? So you might worry that the white teachers were disproportionately given small classes or something. We don't see that that's happening. So in the odd columns, it's a purely naive regression where we regress the treatment on these pre-indicators. In the even columns, we add the school by cohort fixed effects that we think might be important. And what you see is that even in the naive regressions, there's no stars, nothing significant. But when you add the school by cohort fixed effects, even the magnitudes get much smaller, right? Of all these, they basically fall by half. So there was balance in the full sample, and there's even better balance when you're making within school cohort comparisons. In the actual results I'll show you, we're always going to have these school by cohort fixed effects. And in terms of balance, to make you feel better, because this isn't the richest set of covariates to balance on, the Chetty QJE paper shows balance in parents' earnings, which is very convincing, I think. The other thing I think in the paper we show balance on whether the student's name is missing, and whether the student's name is missing is important because that messes up our match to the National Student Clearinghouse records. So there's also balance on that. But, still, I'll hang my hat on the Chetty paper because he has richer stuff to test for balance on. Okay. So, the experiment happened. In the first year, it was implemented with fidelity. We're focusing on the first year where we don't have compliance issues and we don't have attrition issues. The only thing we are worried about is making sure that we make within school cohort comparisons. So this is our school by cohort fixed effect. And we're going to control for class size, we can control for teacher and student X's. And our variable of interest is, did you have a race match in your first year of STAR? It turns out that it doesn't matter how you cluster the standard errors, it doesn't matter how you include the X's. So the results are pretty robust. And again, it's just a simple regression because it's an experiment. Yeah? Okay, so here's the key results for college enrollment. There's a simple dummy for did you ever enroll in college? And we start by only using the kindergarten cohort, partly because that's what all the STAR papers do. And there's a reason for it, which is that if there was ever a time that the experimental assignments happened with fidelity, that was it, because it was new and there was no weird stuff yet. And we see that, yes, in column 1, when we have no controls, having a black teacher in kindergarten raises the probability that you enroll in college by almost 5 percentage points. This is like more than a 10% change from a base enrollment rate of 0.33. And in column 2, when you add a bunch of student and teacher controls, the effect remains about the same and it's still significant, a little more precisely estimated. Yeah?
So this is just the sample of black students?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. We can add white students later for some stuff, but it's purely black. So the black teacher means a match.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. And is it, I mean, when you add the white students and you have...
We'll come back to that.
Okay.
Yeah?
What about the sex of the teacher?
In Tennessee, they are all women. I think there's 3 men. This is kindergarten in the 80s.
But I noticed the
Yes.
effects are greater for boys than for girls in your paper. Isn't that what you find?
I think that's the North Carolina data.
Oh.
But well, in North Carolina, we do have some male teachers, and we can slice the data. Yeah, we'll do that. This is also why we can't do anything with Hispanic or other groups. The teachers are white or black, and they're almost entirely women. Again, this was a long time ago in Tennessee, in early elementary. The male teachers in North Carolina, there we're looking at later grades. So there's more men in the later grades. Okay, now, still the standard errors are bigger than we'd like. So in columns 3 and 4, we pull in everybody, not just the kindergarten cohort. So now we pull in kids who entered a STAR school for the first time in 1st, 2nd, or 3rd grade. And the standard errors get smaller like you'd expect, and the point estimates still are about 0.04, about the same. And again, the estimate's very robust to adding controls. Adding the student controls shouldn't matter if we did random assignment right, so that's part of the balance test. And we can do it separately, but just for space I add them all at once. The other thing we're adding here is teacher controls. Teacher experience, do you have a master's degree, etc. And adding that stuff doesn't matter either, which suggests that it's not a systematic difference in teacher quality that's driving the results.
So just in terms of the magnitudes of about 10% or so here, so how is that relative to teacher experience, sort of other extras of teachers?
So I don't know about teacher experience on effective long-run outcomes like this, but these effect sizes are exactly the same as the long-run effects of having a small class on the same outcomes. Almost exactly the same. They're also quite similar to what we find in our other paper about the effect of teacher expectations. So in terms of other papers looking at long-run effects of early elementary inputs, the effects are pretty similar. Yeah?
Seth, so the effects are driven completely almost by the kindergarten cohort?
Well,
Or
so
the kids that enter in, basically that they had so the grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 are the cohorts, or when the kids join the school?
those are when the kid joined the school. So I interpret these as this is the base effect, right? And then we're saying, does the effect vary for the kids? Is the effect different for kids who entered in first grade, second grade, or third grade? You could argue a little bit about how you interpret this one, I suppose.
Yeah.
But they're individually and jointly insignificant. This one is definitely a 0. the grade 2 cohort effect, if you take this seriously, is more like 1 percentage point. And the grade 3 effect is 3 percentage points. But given the insignificance of these, I sort of treat this as noise, right? These are, if you remember what the samples were, you don't have a ton of power here. So, yeah, I mean, it's a fair question to ask what's going on with the grade 2, I think. But overall, I interpret this as saying there's no real heterogeneity by cohort venture. Yeah. Okay. So we can do a bunch of sensitivity analyses that turn out to be not that interesting. The standard errors all look the same no matter how you cluster them. Doing a logit gives you a similar estimate. Controlling for the share of the class that's black, or controlling for actual class size rather than a dummy for small or large. The effects are all about 0.04. So the results are pretty robust to the extent that we can test for robustness here. So all of that was about college enrollment. And partly we might just be interested in other outcomes, and partly we might be interested in sort of, you know, the robustness of the results spilling over to other outcomes. So did you take the ACT or SAT? Also a 0.04, very similar effect. I was talking with my friend at the College Board about how many people, what share of black students who take the SAT or ACT enroll in college, and a high share of them do. So that's not super surprising. These might be measuring pretty similar things. Next, we leveraged the National Student Clearinghouse data to see, okay, we saw that there's this 4 percentage point effect on enrolling. Where did you enroll? Community college or 2-year public, 4-year public, or private. And here you see that the effect is driven by community college enrollments. And again, that's not super surprising, right? Because if you're thinking about who's on the margin of having your college plans affected by who your kindergarten teacher was, it's people on the margin of going to anything. So there's positive effects throughout, but it's really only, you know, there for the community college enrollments. Mm-hmm.
Do you take this as evidence kind of against potentially the role model story? In that if this is being driven by, I see a black teacher and I therefore want to become a teacher myself because I've seen this kind of role model, that then I would be enrolling in a 4-year, I presume you're required to have a 4-year degree to be a teacher. Or can you do that through community college?
So at this time it wasn't uniformly required.
Okay.
I think. But also, that's a good point. I haven't thought about it in that way. We'll come back to the role model story in a sense. Yeah.
Does it matter if the kid is male or female?
In the STAR data, we don't find significant gender differences, but I think that might be a power thing a little bit. In the STAR data, in North Carolina, when we have 100,000 kids, we do find gender differences. Yeah?
Do you know how many colleges they apply to?
We don't. NSC only tells you schools that they have actually enrolled in. Although some of the NCS data sets that have data on enrollment, or like the Kruger papers about the set of schools you applied to, you might be able to do something with that. Okay, and then lastly, this we're focusing on enrollment. So then a fair question is, are they succeeding once they enroll? And here we have mixed evidence. In terms of persisting to year 2, yes, there's a significant effect on persisting to year 2. However, there's a insignificant effect on earning a degree. And it's hard to know what to make of this a little bit, because back then, the National Student Clearinghouse was collecting data on enrollment from some schools, but not graduation. And so the graduation data is spottier, and we have no way of knowing if it's missing because of a data collection issue, or if it's missing because kids didn't graduate. It's probably a little of each. But because of and the paper gets into the nitty-gritty of the NSC data issues that Josh knows better than me. So we don't, not entirely sure what to make of this, other than if it is a real null effect, it's sort of not surprising, maybe, that having a black teacher in kindergarten is enough to get you to enroll, but not enough to get you through to a 4-year degree. And you can imagine that there's, a lack of support at the college level and things that you can't expect the kindergarten teacher to do everything, I guess. Sure. Yeah? Okay. Okay, so the other big outcome, which is certainly relevant for this population at this time, is high school graduation. And here, we have a really big missing data problem, because high school graduation comes from the state, and it's missing for half the sample. So you might say, like, what are you even bothering with? And some of the other STAR papers don't even bother, because it is missing for half the sample. That said, for those of you that know the history of the paper, the first draft of the paper had no STAR at all in it, and we were using North Carolina data, which had good high school graduation data, and that's where the big result was. So we want to be able to compare this to North Carolina. So the first thing we do is estimate a model, a selection model, where the outcome is a dummy for do we observe your high school outcome. Not did you graduate, but do we observe your high school graduation outcome. And there's a big effect of having a black teacher on us observing your outcome. So this is a glass half full thing, because in a way that's bad. It means our missing data is endogenous. On the other hand, this is actually like a good marker of something, right? Because if we observe your outcome, it means that you stayed engaged with the school system for at least a few years. So this is, from an econometric point of view, this is bad. From like a social point of view, this might be good, right? It's showing you a positive effect of the state-raised teacher. Okay, so then what else can we do? Well, we can estimate the model on, we can estimate the enrollment model on the selected sample, and we see a point estimate of 0.04, which is what we got in the full sample. So that's good. That suggests that we're not getting a totally different sample. The standard error gets big, so the stars go away. But again, the sample fell by more than half. We can also estimate the naive regression of high school graduation using the selected sample and just ignoring the selection problem. And you see an effect of about 5 percentage points. And we can impute the missing outcomes, which you really shouldn't do because it's a missing left-hand side variable, but we do, and that's that. But none of this is super compelling, right? So what is more compelling is to do sort of a bounds type procedure where we plug in different outcomes for the missing data. And so, for example, if your graduation outcome is missing, we can assume that you did not graduate for everybody, or we can assume that you did graduate. And in a sense, these 2 points give us extreme bounds for the effect. Now, which is more realistic? Well, if you're totally missing your graduation outcome, it's more likely you didn't graduate than you did. So we're more sort of looking at this side of the picture. And what you see is that the effect is about 0.04 for sort of reasonable levels of imputing the missing value. But even if you make the totally wrong extreme assumption, you still get a positive effect on graduation. So, and if you plug in the sample mean, it's something like here. So there's probably an effect on high school graduation, is where I would leave this. And then we'll come back with North Carolina, where we have much better data on graduation to confirm that. Okay. 4:45? Okay. So now we'll think through mechanisms. We talked about the 3 possible stories. The black teachers are better than the white teachers. We already think that that's not true because we showed that controlling for experience doesn't change our estimates. Maybe black teachers are better at teaching black students. Maybe there's this role model effect. Maybe there's some of each. Okay, so we can sort of rule out story 1. Again, we already know that controlling for experience doesn't matter, so they're not better on observable dimensions, but maybe they're better on unobservable dimensions. So now we'll use the white kids. If the black teachers are just systematically better, they should benefit the white kids. And that's easy to do. We can rerun our baseline model on the white-only sample, and we can even restrict that to the sample of integrated classrooms, and we see pretty precise zeros. So there's no effect of a black teacher on white kids' outcomes, positive or negative. It's a 0. Okay. The next thing we can do is to pool black and white students and add classroom fixed effects and compare black kids to white kids who are in the same classroom. And here we see effects of about 0.04, which is exactly what our baseline model gives us. These are imprecisely estimated. Again, we lose a ton of power when we have classroom fixed effects because we're really identified off classrooms with, well, integrated classrooms. But taken together, this suggests that there's no effect either way on white kids, which suggests that it's not that the black teachers are better on unobservable dimensions either. So we've ruled out story 1. Yeah?
Sorry, to back up just a little bit. So when you do observe high school graduation, do you observe the district and or the school that they're graduating from?
No. So if they leave the state, we absolutely have no closure. And if they go to a private school, we have absolutely no clue. And even if they leave a star school, it's iffy. Because the star matching to the state records wasn't perfect. So it's very imperfect data.
I'm wondering if exposure to this, so entry into the experiment could induce people to flee from these schools in the first place. And it's actually, the outcomes are from sort of intermediate exposure to sort of better teachers or something like that. And I'm wondering if there's any way in the data to sort of ask that question.
Exposure to the experiment or exposure to a
Well,
treatment?
so like anecdotally, we're saying that people sort of got savvy to the fact that they were in this experiment and got angry, and potentially left. I'm wondering.
No. They got angry if they were in a big class and wanted to switch to a small class.
Sure.
Yeah.
But given sort of response to this, I can imagine sort of a more extreme response to that, in which case they're like, I want to choice into a different school if that's an option in Tennessee or something like that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What I'm saying?
I don't think that's...
It's tenuous, but I'm just wondering if there's any way to rule that out explicitly.
I don't think so. I think being assigned to a small class and being assigned to a same-race teacher reduces the probability of attrition. That's about all we can say. In terms of switching to private school, that's not in the budget constraint for most of the sample. And in terms of sort of savvily changing to a better public school is also probably out of the budget set. But whether there was school choice is a good question. I should look that up.
Are you going to get to the results from the other data set at all? Or you just, okay, because.
Okay. Okay, I'll skip. I'll skip through the bulk of the model and just say two things about the model. The model's in the paper, and you can read it. But basically, we propose two different production functions. One production function allows for culturally relevant pedagogy effects, where black teachers are just better with black kids. And if that's true, then you would see dosage effects of having multiple better teachers. Alternatively, we model the role model story as a Bayesian updating story, where the black teacher essentially presents a signal of what's possible for someone who looks like me. And in that case, there would be diminishing returns to a second black teacher. We test for dosage, and we find mixed results. For some outcomes, we find dosage effects. For other results, we find diminishing returns. But the dosage stuff is a little tenuous because we're using, at that point, we have to use the sample of second and third year in STAR. And there we can only control for attrition on observables. So essentially, we find evidence for both stories. North Carolina gives us a chance to further test these two stories, which we'll do. Okay.
Sorry. Is there any sort of guidance sort of in this literature or a theoretical story about when the particular timing of exposure to this role model might matter more? Is it sort of earliest on, I mean, which would be nice for your experiment, or is it sort of later during what time of educational development, this sort of exposure to it?
Yeah, so I don't know of any good evidence on that, and we are very limited in how much we can test for timing effects here. Because in North Carolina, we're looking at 3 grades, grades 3 to 5, and in STAR, we're looking at K to 3. We already showed that there's a bigger effect in kindergarten, but we don't know if that's noise or what, and it's not significantly bigger in kindergarten, it's just bigger.
Isn't there a book, All You Needed to Learn, You Learned in Kindergarten?
Yeah.
Peer review, definitely on top.
It used to be a bestseller.
So, yeah, if you believe our North Carolina results, they're very similar in size to the STAR results. And if you think that they're in any way comparable, it suggests that the effect is fairly constant across K to 5. But we haven't done middle school. That would be future work someone in the room could do.
Seth, is there any evidence of cumulative effects? So if you have 2 years consecutive of black teachers.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about the dosage.
Yes, one no, one yes.
Right. So that's what I'm saying about the dosage effects. It's very mixed.
Okay.
For the SAT taking, there's no dosage at all, which is consistent with the role model story.
Yeah.
And for college enrollment, there are dosage effects, which is consistent with race match skills, specific teaching skills. But all of that's caveated with the fact that we are necessarily using a non-randomly attributed sample. So that's another, I think, useful thing for future work to figure out. In North Carolina, we don't see a ton of dosage. Now, in North Carolina, though, we have a much bigger problem with selection. So we follow Bettinger and Long in principle, even though we sort of back off what they actually do. So basically, we have an IV setup where our endogenous variable is ever match. Did you ever have a black teacher? Did you have at least one black teacher at grades 3 to 5? That's what we know. Our instrument is share. And share is the share of black teachers that you had the potential of having between grades 3 and 5. Assuming that you stayed in your grade 3 school, assuming you progressed from grades 3 to 4 to 5 on schedule. So that's our instrument. And Bettinger and Long use this type of instrument in a few other papers. They use it to study the effect of adjunct instructors by instrumenting for the within department change in the share of faculty who are adjunct and things like that. So that's our instrument. And then one thing to do is to just estimate this system by two least squares as usual, where we always have school fixed effects and maybe we even have school time trends. Another thing that you might want to do is just to estimate the reduced form effect of share on the long run outcome. Now, the reason you might do that is that even if the instrument is exogenous, in the sense that it's not correlated with other stuff, in some of our conversations today, we've already talked about why this exclusion restriction might fail. And the reason is that there might be reasons that the share of black teachers in your school matters other than through the propensity that you have to have a black teacher. For example, maybe I never have a black teacher, but I see the other black teacher at lunch and talk and ask for advice and so on. Then the exclusion restriction fails, even if the instrument is exogenous in the sense of randomly changing over time. Okay, so we think that this might actually be happening, so we prefer the reduced form estimates as well. And we do a bunch of stuff to show that otherwise the instrument looks good. There's balance and so on. Okay, so here are the reduced form results, and now we do have power to split by sex. This is sex of the student. Okay, and we have good data on high school dropout. So North Carolina, even though it's not an experiment, has some good stuff going on. So the first three columns look at high school dropout. First off, we use the full sample, and what do we see? We see that the share of black teachers significantly reduces dropout, but only for male students, right? And this is, in some sense, this is consistent with the literature about the changing gender gap in educational attainment. So the male students are the only ones affected on the high school dropout margin. Yeah? Okay. Moving down to panel B, now we use Donarski and Michael Moore's definition of persistently disadvantaged. So this is a really strict measure of kids who are eligible for free lunch in every year of grade K to 8. This is a much stronger definition of disadvantage than were you ever free lunch or were you free lunch in that year. Okay. And again, we see bigger effects that are entirely loading on male students. Yeah? And then finally, we can add school-specific time trends to the model that already had school-fixed effects to really control for trends that are maybe, maybe there's trends in the share of black teachers and outcomes or something. Okay, well, when we add the trends, the results and patterns are robust. It's only the males. Okay. Less precisely estimated a little bit, but so that's the high school dropout results. And then how should we interpret this? Well, remember that this is a share. This is a share between 0 and 1. That's an out-of-sample prediction to go from 0 to 1, right? So a realistic change is like a 10 percentage point change. So if you just want to scale this by a decimal point, it gives you a more reasonable estimate. All right, and then comes 4 to 6. Now we look at self-reported college intent in 11th grade. Yeah?
Sorry, so on that point, so these are, so we think about a 10% increase in number of black teachers in a particular school. That's going to reduce high school dropout by 0.5%.
Yeah, half a
Okay.
percentage point.
So it's statistically significant. Is there a sense to which is this in the literature kind of
Yeah,
economically
because
significant?
dropout rates are on the order of like 10 to 20%.
Okay.
So in percentage terms, and I compute it on the next slide, I think.
Okay.
Um,
But then your magnitudes are not comparable across North Carolina and
Not yet.
Tennessee, right? Okay, so you're not.
This
you're
is
not to the point.
this is totally
Yeah.
different parameter.
And
Yeah.
these are all black kids still.
Yes. Yeah.
And nothing yet with the share of the same sex and race. It's
Not
just
yet.
it's just
Right. Yeah.
I wonder to what degree, since these teachers are mostly women,
Yeah.
and the effect is mostly for boys,
Yeah.
to what degree is the result found more strongly for boys who are raised by one parent?
Mm.
Because it
Yeah.
could
Yeah. That's a
be,
really good.
you know, it could be that there's something about it would help you distinguish between the
Yeah, yeah.
role model and the cultural thing.
Do we know the sex of single
If you,
parents?
if you can also have a subsample of boys who
Yeah.
were raised by a single mom, for example.
Yeah.
I think even the education variable in that data set is like, it could be either parent. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think that you get traction on like parents,
Okay.
family structure in the education data.
I should look into that though. That's a
because,
good.
because a teacher could
Yeah, yeah,
become
yeah.
a more important adult
Yeah, yeah,
figure
yeah.
if there
No, I
is
agree.
only
I
one
agree.
parent.
I am. I don't think we're going to be able to sort out the sex of single parents, or really if
Or
there
even
is a
just
single parent. Period. Because this is administered data from the school system. Yeah, I should check though.
Do you
The
know?
school
Can you
might-
identify the gender of the teacher?
Yes. Yes. Okay. That was high school dropout. For college intent, you see a few interesting things. First off, in the full sample, there's nothing, right? But the full sample is not exactly comparable to what we saw in STAR, right? STAR was a disadvantaged sample. In the disadvantaged sample, there is a big effect, and it's there for the boys and girls. So different margins, different treatment effects. And again, this is robust to adding school time trends. So this makes us believe the instrument in the randomness sense, but again, not necessarily exclusion restriction, but there's no exclusion restriction here, this is reduced form. Okay, now here's what some of you wanted by teacher gender. And here, if you look at the difference in coefficients, they're never significantly different, but they're qualitatively different in the ways you'd expect, right? So, when you look at high school dropout for males, the male dropout effect is driven by both male and female teachers, right? It's bigger for male teachers, but not significantly different. So this is what you'd expect, that the male effect is bigger. There is a race and gender effect, but it's not significantly different. The point here is just that they benefit, period. Boys do. Now, for the college intent, there is this matrix that you'd expect. And again, here the p-values are much closer to being significant. And what you see here is that, remember, the college intent effect was there for everybody, right? But the male effect is driven by male same-race teachers. It's still positive for female teachers, but smaller and insignificant. And for females, it's really driven by female teachers. So yes, there is this extra dimension of sex by race and age.
So that supports your story of the role model.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, now, we wanted this to be comparable to STAR. For it to be comparable to STAR, we need to do the instrument procedure. Again, whether if we swallow the exclusion restriction, we can apply two-stage least squares, and what we find are for, well, I'll just look at college intent since that's what we focused on in the STAR data. The effect of having at least one black teacher is about 9 percentage points. And if we estimate an equivalent parameter in star, it's about 0.07. So very, very similar. Now again, I don't totally believe this if you really want to be a stickler about the exclusion restriction. And here's why. Dan Black and Jeff Smith and Bob Lalonde have this really amazing new paper that I like a lot, testing instrument assumptions. And it's really sort of clever. And we sort of independently discovered that this was a useful test. And that is to estimate the reduced form separately for the treated and control groups. There should not be an effect of the instrument for the non-treated group. It's really intuitive. But we do see an effect of the instrument in these two separate subsamples, and it shouldn't be there. So again, we failed our test for a good instrument, but this is entirely consistent with black teachers mattering and the exclusion restriction failing. Yeah?
Why do you think for the females it's not showing up as much that they have, you know, significant reductions in being a high school dropout, but for college intent it increases?
So I think that girls are more mature and they're just more likely to graduate high school in the first place. And their low levels of attainment are less malleable to school inputs like that than boys. Okay, so to wrap up and say something about bringing all this together on time, we replicate the STAR findings with the IV estimates. I think the reduced form shows even more credible causal evidence that black teachers matter for long-run outcomes. The estimates are pretty robust. There's a bunch of stuff we didn't put in the paper. In terms of percentage effects, these are non-trivial effects that are similar to other early educational inputs. To make sense of those small point estimates.
What is RF?
Reduced form. Something else that I didn't show you today is that when we split the sample by college-educated parents, there's no effect there either, which is similar to the. It's essentially the same as the persistently poor, non-persistently poor. Okay. So, experimental evidence from STAR and this quasi-experimental evidence from North Carolina show that black teachers matter for long-run outcomes, no matter which outcome you're looking at in terms of aspirational college plans or self-reported plans or actual enrollment. The effect is very similar to the effect of small classes and some other early interventions. The results are consistent with role model effects and with the culturally relevant pedagogy, we think. I didn't dig into the model, but I think the model is sort of an interesting way to formalize what role model effects are. And then, what does all this mean? Well, the obvious thing is to say, well, we should hire more black teachers. And I am on record as saying that that's a good thing and we should do it. I'm also on record as saying it's very difficult, if not impossible, to do overnight, and even in the next year or two, because there's a long pipeline problem of training black teachers, and there's also a general equilibrium issue where if there's underrepresentation in other fields, it's really hard to say that, well, you shouldn't be an engineer because we need you to be a teacher. And in the paper, we do a little back-of-the-envelope calculation to show that literally pulling black college students from higher-paying majors into teaching, which is a lower-paying major, you'd exacerbate racial wage gaps and so on. So this isn't an overnight sort of solution. That said, there's a lot more we can do to recruit, retain, and train black teachers, but that's a longer run goal. So then, what can we do in the short run? There's at least two short run interventions that would work, I think. One of them is to increase exposure to role models. And that increased exposure doesn't have to happen in the form of teachers. There's a really neat study by Breda et al. In France where They bring non-teacher female scientists into high school science classrooms, and they do it experimentally, and they show that when they bring in a female scientist, the female students' college applications to science programs go up. There's absolutely an analog here in terms of bringing in professionals or career day or whatever to sort of strategically present professional role models in schools that can be really short. These were 1-hour visits. These are things that people volunteer to do, community engagement schools can do. Okay. Related to that, you could also think about how you assign teachers within schools to sort of maximize black students' exposure to the black teachers you already have. And then the third policy, which is also, I think, important, is just training everybody better. In our other work, we show that white teachers have biased expectations for black students that harm black student outcomes. So there's all sorts of implicit bias and empathy trainings that are very light-touch, low-cost workshops. Okinofuwa's intervention is 45 minutes long and basically just helps teachers of all backgrounds empathize with student experiences. And this simple one-off workshop at the beginning of the year reduced suspensions, increased achievement, and so on. So there's sort of creative ways to leverage the human capital in the school and in the community, and there's also light-touch, low-cost trainings that can improve black and white teachers' effectiveness. Yeah.
Another policy implication is that if you've shown that the black kids who come from disadvantaged background are more likely to be positively influenced by a black teacher. So, so I don't know if that's included in your list there, but the school districts could assign black teacher in a selective way, and they could even within a school they could make the black teachers available for the more disadvantaged children.
Yes, I'm not sure how comfortable I am with that.
I'm behind you there.
Extreme sorting, but and there's always a concern about these results should not lead to resegregating classrooms, and there's already I don't think that that's true, and I think something that we can't speak to directly in the paper, but I sort of believe is that white students benefit from exposure to
you
black
should
students.
get help from blacks who've been educated in all black colleges, and they are very, there's Lisa Cook is very active on Twitter. She's very much into that. She's very active in promoting her college. I forgot what it's called. And because it's not just at kindergarten, you have, college level and experiments in Detroit and other things. So yeah, it sounds a little bit, problematic politically, but I think it's worth investigating this more in conjunction.
Well,
with
I guess what I'm uncomfortable with is the logical extension of your suggestion is that you're putting the poor kids in one class and the rich kids in another class, right?
No, you're putting the teacher where they're more needed.
Yeah, there's the segregation.
But
is there any work done with minorities also? If you're a minority and you're exposed to being taught by a minority, whether that is black or any other minority group?
So, no, and I think that's a huge sort of next step for this literature is to look at other ethnic groups. There's a Fairley and Oriopolis have a paper about community college instructors and using a big, I think, Northern California community college. And there they have a little power to show effects by, so for Asian, Hispanic, and black and white students. We could probably push harder than that in North Carolina, but again, we have, we haven't done it yet. And I know there's a group, in theory, you could do this with data from Texas or Florida. well too. But no, we haven't done that. But it's someone should.
Thank you so much, Seth.
Thanks.
I think a particularly fantastic job on a very sort of sensitive and delicate topic, for sure. You can tell he comes from a school of public affairs as well. So thank you very much. Next week, Kevin Schneppel will be visiting us from Simon Fraser University, and I look forward to, I think, to talk about heroin for listeners on there. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you.